What would you do if every mistake you made came with a price in blood? In the harsh, unforgiving Wild West, lawbreakers faced horrors that go beyond what we can imagine today.
And they would take people and they would hack their arms and legs off, and while they were alive, throw them on a fire.
From gruesome floggings to horrific forms of torture, the frontier was a place where punishment meant pain, real, unbearable pain. But how far did these brutal punishments go? And who decided the fate of those who crossed the line? Prepare to witness the savage consequences of lawlessness in 15 most brutal punishments of the Wild West. Number 15. Hanging or lynching. Kicking off our list of brutal punishments is a discipline with the highest number of recorded deaths. In the lawless lands of the Wild West, justice here was often quick, harsh, and delivered without any courtroom formalities. Public hangings weren't just a means to an end. They became harsh spectacles of capital punishment, attracting crowds with their morbid curiosity. The Wild West was like a stage where vigilante mobs acted as judge, jury, and executioner, often dealing with suspected wrongdoers without any hint of a fair trial. Victims, often accused of theft, murder, or being in the wrong place at the wrong time, were dragged to the nearest trees or gallows. The scene is usually swift and brutal. With a rope around their neck, they are lifted off the ground, their feet kicking desperately as they fight for breath. This method's brutality wasn't just in its speed, but in its slow and painful climax. Victims often suffered long deaths from suffocation that could last several agonizing minutes. Lynchings were common during this time, tragically showing another dark side of human nature. Black people who dared to behave outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable conduct found themselves facing terrifying lynch mobs. The NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded in 1909, later estimated that between 1889 and 1922, there were around 3,500 lynchings, a chilling depiction of how widespread this form of mob justice had become. Public hangings were rituals with societal implications. It wasn't just reserved for the worst crimes. It was often used for anyone who defied the norms at the time. Even a mere accusation could seal someone's fate. In many cases, the mob didn't wait for the sheriff. They will take the law into their hands, driven by anger and impatience. And with no trial, there was no hope of proving innocence. Communities gathered in large numbers to watch these events that highlighted power dynamics and served as stark warnings to anyone thinking about stepping out of line. While some saw it as rightful retribution, others viewed it as society's darkest hour, where humanity hung alongside those condemned. Even as terrifying as the noose was, the brutality of the Wild West didn't stop there. Some punishments didn't just leave one dead, it leaves the victim burning in agony. Number 14. Tar and feathering. Imagine this, the sun setting over a dusty frontier town, the air thick with anticipation. Suddenly, a man is dragged into the square, shouting pleas lost in the eager chatter of onlookers. He's stripped down, his skin bared to the elements. A pot of tar bubbles ominously nearby. This sets the scene for Wild West's brutal punishment of tar and feathering. This method didn't originate in the Wild West. It traces back to medieval Europe, making its way across the Atlantic with early settlers. By the time it reached American soil, it had become a favored tool for vigilante justice during turbulent times. Particularly popular during periods of unrest such as the American Revolution, it was a favorite punishment used by those looking to enforce their own brand of justice without waiting for legal proceedings. Victims usually have hot tar poured over their skin, a searing pain that clings stubbornly, refusing to release its grip. Then come the feathers, sticking like glue to every inch of flesh. The result is a hideous caricature meant to strip away dignity and identity. This living spectacle wasn't just about inflicting physical pain. It turned individuals into objects of public ridicule, walking reminders of what happens when one crosses certain societal lines. People who found themselves on the receiving end of this particularly harsh punishment were often those who dared deviate from community norms or held unpopular opinions. Tax collectors during colonial times were frequent targets as resentment grew against British-imposed taxes. Moreover, anyone deemed untrustworthy or morally questionable risked becoming a feathered outcast. The brutality of this method lies not only in its physical torment, but also in its capacity for psychological devastation. Public humiliation inflicts wounds deeper than any branding iron could muster. They lingered long after the scars had healed. This is a social death sentence more agonizing than any solitary confinement. For spectators gathered around these unfortunate souls, witnessing such scenes engraved memories both terrifying and suggestive onto their minds. An indelible mark left upon communities where lawlessness reigned supreme, or a punishment waiting for any offender. As the crowd dispersed from the tar and feather spectacle, whispers of another, more savage punishment filled the air, one that left the victims hiding their heads in shame. Number 13. Scalping. Have you ever wondered how far brutality could go in the untamed Wild West, where a single act of vengeance could leave scars on your head and far beyond the physical? Originating from conflicts between Native American tribes and European settlers, scalping became an infamous symbol of brutality during this chaotic time. It was often seen as a tool for revenge and warfare in the Wild West. Before European settlers arrived in America, various Native American tribes already practiced scalping as part of their warfare tactics. To them, a scalp represented victory and bravery. The actual process of scalping was as horrifying as it sounds. With swift, violent cuts, a sharp blade would sever the scalp from a victim's head, leaving behind a bloody, excruciating wound. Survivors, though rare, were left permanently scarred, both physically and mentally. Most, however, succumbed to the brutal consequences of infection or blood loss. It was an act of punishment, and it was a slow, agonizing death sentence. Conversely, settlers used it to instill fear in local tribes and as revenge for raids. This gruesome cycle became especially prevalent during intense conflicts like the French and Indian War and various frontier skirmishes. During these times, mere accusations or suspicions could lead to someone losing their scalp, whether they were a settler or tribal member. This cruel method leaves behind more than physical scars. It imprints deep psychological trauma on the communities involved. For those who survived such an ordeal, they bore permanent reminders marked into their very being, both physically through scar tissue. As if scalping wasn't enough to instill fear, there was yet another gruesome punishment lurking in the shadows, leaving a searing mark of shame and cruelty. Number 12. Branding. There's no escaping your past in the Wild West, especially when your guilt is burned into your skin. Cruelty may be just about the right word to describe this method of punishment. Picture this: a fire crackling in anticipation, irons heating up to a scorching temperature. The offender, tied up and probably shaking with fear awaiting their punishment. This was a setting in the Wild West for one of the most brutal punishments: branding. This was a harsh and permanent punishment for thieves and outlaws. It was beyond a slap on the wrist. It was a painful mark burned into their skin. This practice, which has been around since ancient times, found its place in the lawless lands where not only cattle were branded. Branding involved pressing these hot irons onto bare skin, usually on the forehead or cheek, leaving behind letters that labeled them for life. A T for thief or H for horse thief were common marks, each letter burning not just into flesh, but deep into one's identity. Most times, these letters were branded on a part of the body where everyone can see it. This was a deliberate act to mark offenders and instill fear in the people that such punishment awaits anyone found wanting. Branding became popular during a time when traditional jails were rare, and society preferred deterrence over rehabilitation. The practice thrived in towns where quick justice was needed to maintain order amidst chaos. For crimes like theft or cattle rustling, branding was the go-to punishment, making sure that criminals carried their guilt openly, a walking advertisement of their wrongdoings. While the physical pain was unbearable, the psychological aftermath also made branding truly cruel. Being marked as a criminal meant being constantly rejected. Branded individuals were often excluded from communities and left with little chance of redemption. The scar shouted their sins to everyone who passed by. Those who were branded lived under constant scrutiny, always judged by an unchangeable mistake. Communities viewed them with suspicion or contempt, reinforcing isolation and despair. Branding left permanent reminders of guilt, but its brutality pales in comparison to the torture of our next punishment. Number 11. The Spanish Tickler. In an era where justice was swift and brutal, few methods inspired more fear than this vicious claw-like tool. Its very name hid the gruesome reality of its use. This is a tool of torture so vicious that it shreds flesh like paper. In the brutal chaos of the Wild West, there existed a device that left its victims in unimaginable agony, a method of punishment so cruel it sent shivers down the spine of even the most hardened outlaws. This tool was designed to both punish and instill fear. It serves as a grim reminder of the extreme measures humans have taken to cause suffering. This claw-like device was simple yet horrifyingly effective, used to tear into the flesh of its victims, ripping skin and muscle from the bone without mercy. The very mention of the Spanish Tickler could send shivers down the spine of anyone who understood its brutal purpose. The device featured sharp, curved claws that were often attached to a long handle, allowing torturers to exert maximum force while maintaining a safe distance from their writhing victims. The excruciating pain caused by the tickler often led to a prolonged and agonizing death, as victims succumbed not only to immediate injuries, but also to infections and blood loss. It is widely believed that these devices became popular during the Middle Ages in Europe, later spreading to various regions including the Wild West. The aim was clear: extract confessions or punish those deemed guilty. In communities where lawlessness prevailed, such gruesome methods were seen as necessary evils to maintain some semblance of order. There is little evidence pointing to a single inventor. Rather, it likely evolved from earlier torture techniques, refined by those with a disturbing talent for inventing new ways of causing human suffering. Within these frontier towns, tales of the Spanish tickler's use spread like wildfire, not just because of its physical impact, but also due to its psychological grip on society. The mere threat of this punishment could coerce individuals into confessing crimes they may not have committed, highlighting its effectiveness beyond physical harm. The agony of the Spanish tickler may have been unbearable, but when swift justice was needed, the next punishment offered a much quicker, albeit final, judgment. Number 10. The Firing Squad. Imagine a dusty courtyard in the Wild West, where tension fills the air. Here, a group of men with rifles stands ready to deliver swift justice to those found guilty of serious crimes like desertion or treason. In this harsh method of execution, there was no room for mercy. The condemned would be brought out, often blindfolded or with their hands tied, facing multiple guns aimed at them. The fear was real. Knowing that in moments, bullets would end their life was terrifying. Some saw this as a more honorable death than hanging, but it didn't ease the fear on their faces. Execution by firing squad wasn't just about punishment, it was about making an example. In a time when lawlessness could spread quickly, this fast response served as both revenge and a warning. It was common during times when keeping order meant taking strong action against those who broke society's rules beyond repair. While it might seem like something from a gritty Western movie scene, Firing squads were indeed used throughout history, and not just in the Wild West. Soldiers who deserted during the war were especially at risk for this fate. But civilians accused of terrible acts weren't safe either. Yet, it's not just the condemned who suffered. Executioners themselves struggled with the mental burden of their job. Every time they pulled the trigger, it left echoes that stayed long after the smoke cleared. Spectators too were affected by what they saw, a lasting reminder of mortality and how thin the line is between order and chaos. The gunfire may have stopped, but its effects stayed with everyone involved. Being faced with multiple gunshots may end one's life in a blink, but this punishment takes a part of your face even quicker. Number 9. Ear cropping and nose slitting. What's worse? The pain of punishment or carrying the evidence of your crime forever. The answer might surprise you in this brutal method of frontier justice. Ear cropping and nose slitting were methods that did just that, delivering the dual blow of immediate pain and enduring humiliation. These brutal measures weren't reserved for the faint-hearted. They were the dark epitome of frontier justice, mirroring through the wild lands like a ghostly reminder of what awaited those who stepped out of line. This grim scene often sees a criminal, bound and at the mercy of those who sought retribution, facing the cruel fate of having their ears cropped or nose slit. This wasn't merely about inflicting physical harm, but was designed to perpetuate suffering long into the future. The Wild West often saw this method employed as both punishment and deterrent. It also serves as a vivid warning meant to instill fear in the hearts of potential wrongdoers. This was most prevalent during times when law enforcement was scarce and communities took justice into their own hands. Often, petty criminals or those accused of theft found themselves at the receiving end of this gruesome punishment. In some cases, even women suspected of adultery or witchcraft became targets. For victims, the pain didn't end after their ears were cropped or their noses slit. They bore these marks for life, a visible testament to their alleged crimes, affecting how they were perceived by society. The haunting specter of ear cropping and nose slitting also served as a chilling story passed down through generations. Families would tell tales of ancestors who endured these punishments as cautionary examples to deter future transgressions. This ensured that even when lawmen rode into town and formal courts began to establish order, the echoes of such harsh punishments lingered on, shaping societal norms and behaviors long after these practices had faded into history. Marks of shame might have lingered after ear cropping or nose slitting, but for many, punishment came in the form of searing lashes that cut deep, both physically and emotionally. Number 8. Flogging or whipping. Picture a punishment so severe that it left men broken, not just in body but in spirit. Where the sound of each strike echoed across a silent crowd, the pain almost palpable to onlookers. The Wild West wasn't just about shootouts and saloons. It was also home to merciless forms of justice that tore through the flesh and dignity of those who defied the law. Flogging, a brutal punishment carried out in broad daylight, was one such method. The setting was often grim, with townsfolk gathering under the scorching sun or amidst a chill breeze, waiting to witness the punishment unfold. The atmosphere is usually thick with anticipation, the air almost still as the offender is led forward. Bound tightly to a wooden post, arms stretched and wrists tied, the condemned had nowhere to escape the lashes that awaited them. The whip, long, cruel, and unforgiving, would cut through the air with a terrifying whistle, before landing with a sickening crack on bare skin. Each lash tore deep, leaving bloody welts and scars that would serve as permanent reminders of their crime. The executioners, often lawmen or soldiers, were hardened individuals who showed no mercy. They held power not only in their authority, but also in the strength of their arms, delivering the blows with precision, aiming to break both the flesh and the will of the offender. The crowd would remain eerily silent, some watching in horror, others with cold indifference, as lash after lash sliced through skin and dignity. Flogging's roots dig deep into ancient history, but its presence in the Wild West was a remnant of colonial times. The number of lashes often depended on the severity of the offense and the whims of local authority figures. Not everyone faced the whip with the same frequency. This method was predominantly inflicted upon lower-class citizens and those deemed undesirable by society, drifters, petty criminals, or anyone who couldn't afford to pay fines imposed by local courts. In some cases, it even targeted those accused without a proper trial, with frontier justice being notoriously swift and unforgiving. The deterrent effect was palpable. Spectators would gather not only to witness justice, but also to reaffirm their own adherence to societal norms, lest they find themselves at the receiving end of this painful corrective measure. Flogging wasn't merely about enforcing the law. It was about maintaining order amidst chaos in an untamed land where formal legal systems were often weeks away by horseback. The practice left indelible marks on both its victims and observers, setting an example that resonates with tales from that wild epoch. Yet even this doesn't capture all forms of justice wrought in those days. Number 7. The stake. The smell of smoke in the town square wasn't always from cooking fires. Sometimes it marked the final moments of a brutal sentence. In the heart of town squares, where whispers of rumors and tales of bravery mingled with the dusty air, a gruesome spectacle often took center stage: burning at the stake. This method of execution was not for the faint-hearted. It was an extreme form of justice reserved for those deemed to have committed heinous offenses. Crimes such as witchcraft, heresy, and treason could lead one to this fiery fate. The accused would be tied to a wooden post, surrounded by a pile of wood ready to ignite with righteous fury. The execution itself was a public event, designed not only to punish, but to deter others from walking a similar path. Townspeople would gather, their faces reflecting a mix of horror and morbid curiosity, as flames licked around the body of the condemned. The crackling fire served as both judge and executioner, its relentless heat depicting the severity of frontier law. While this brutal practice found its roots in medieval Europe, it made its way across the ocean during times when fear gripped communities like wildfire. The Wild West saw its fair share of such grim spectacles, particularly during periods when law was but a whisper in the wind. In these lawless lands, accusations could swiftly lead one to face death by fire, a practice steeped in both superstition and social control. This method is part of the broader history of the death penalty, which has seen various forms throughout different cultures and eras. Examining cases where individuals were sentenced to death by fire reveals much about societal fears and values. Fire being seen as both purifying and punishing. Those who faced this horrifying end often became cautionary tales, their stories woven into the fabric of community lore. Such executions were meant to instill fear, but also served as reminders of unchecked power, wielded by those enforcing frontier justice. Culturally, burning at the stake symbolized ultimate condemnation. It was an act meant to obliterate not just life, but any trace of existence deemed dangerous or heretical. Witnesses to such events might carry with them a lifetime's worth of haunting memories, the scent of smoke mingling with screams, lingering long after ashes had blown away. If death by fire wasn't terrifying enough, there was an equally grim alternative, one that didn't leave ashes, but bodies submerged in water. Number 6. Drowning in a barrel. The unforgiving sun bore down on the dusty streets of the Wild West, but for some, the real heat came from within a wooden barrel filled with water. Drowning in a barrel is a method lost to time, yet hauntingly memorable in its cruelty, and stands as one of the more peculiar and brutal punishments of this lawless era. Victims are being bound, helpless, as they are submerged into a drum of water, inch by agonizing inch, feeling the coolness creeping up their skin while panic grips their chest. Each breath becomes more laborious. They would experience the ultimate nightmare, a slow suffocation where every gulp of air became a battle against the liquid enveloping them. For those unfortunate enough to endure this fate, it was not just death that awaited them, but an excruciating dance with despair. This form of punishment was not just about physical torment. It was an embodiment of societal norms around crime and retribution. The Wild West was no stranger to harsh justice, and drowning in a barrel mirrored a community's desperate attempt to maintain order through fear and spectacle. A person condemned to this fate faced not only the terror of drowning, but also the psychological torment of claustrophobia, enveloped by darkness and the muffled sounds beyond their watery prison. What misdeeds warranted such an extreme punishment? During its prevalence in certain parts of the Wild West, drowning in a barrel was reserved for offenses deemed particularly heinous or treacherous. Betrayals that shook the very foundation of trust within tight-knit communities, or acts that defied moral codes set by society's unwritten laws. Accounts from history sketch vivid images of offenders meeting their doom inside these makeshift tombs. Drowning was terrifying and led to an agonizing death. Some punishments didn't leave the victims dead, rather, they left permanent scars. Now, it's time for today's subscriber pick. Take a moment to examine the image. What's happening here? Could this be a glimpse into one of the many brutal punishments handed down during that era? The strained expressions, the rough handling, everything hints at a scene of agony and suffering. Let your imagination run wild and look into the most brutal punishments of the Wild West. What do you think? Was this a common punishment, or could it be something else entirely? Let us know in the comment section below. Number 5. Running the gauntlet. Talking about rough handling, what if your punishment was running, but this time running an endless line of beatings, each blow stronger than the last? This was no ordinary adventure. It was a gauntlet of agony. Running the gauntlet, a term that might sound like a daring adventure or a challenging obstacle course, was anything but that. In the untamed territories of the Wild West, it was a brutal and informal form of community-enforced punishment. Here, the hapless offender is forced to run between two parallel lines of people, each armed with clubs, whips, or other weapons. The victim was not just running for their life, but enduring relentless beatings and unending humiliation. This punishing ritual is physically grueling. Also, it strips away dignity in an open-air spectacle for all to witness. Running the gauntlet is about delivering justice. It often spelled doom for the accused. The physical toll is usually immense. Broken bones, deep bruises, flesh torn open by unyielding blows. Victims rarely emerged unscathed. Many never made it to the end of the line. Death or permanent injury was commonplace, a grim testament to this method's savagery. These lines could stretch dozens of yards long. Depending on community size and eagerness for retribution, it could seem endless. This form of mob justice wasn't reserved for hardened criminals alone. Sometimes petty offenders found themselves at its mercy. Those who dared cross societal norms or fell out of favor with influential townsfolk risked facing this gruesome gauntlet. Running through the gauntlet was one way to face the rage of the crowd, but for some, the punishment didn't end there. It continued with a galloping horse dragging you toward your doom. Number 4. Horse dragging. The American frontier wasn't just about shootouts and saloons. What if you were tied to the very crime you committed? This punishment made sure there was no coming back. In the Wild West, horse dragging was a brutal punishment for horse thieves. This harsh justice was meant to scare potential criminals and show the community's resolve. The setting often sees a person, guilty or not, tied by their ankles to a horse they once tried to steal. With a command, the horse would run, dragging the person across rough ground. This often resulted in severe injuries or even death. These extreme measures were taken because official law enforcement was either absent or ineffective. The threat of horse dragging served as both a deterrent and a reminder of what awaited those who broke the rules. The legacy of horse dragging is still felt today. It shows how extreme punishments were used not just for immediate revenge, but also as lessons for the community. This history has influenced our current views on justice, reminding us of a time when cruelty was mistaken for order. From the dust of the desert to the depths of icy water, punishment in the Wild West had no limits. But what happens when drowning becomes the next trial? Number 3. The water test or dunking. Imagine being accused of a crime you haven't committed, dragged to the edge of a river, and faced with an ordeal that could very well end your life. Welcome to the terrifying world of the water test, commonly referred to as dunking, a method dripping with injustice and fear from the Wild West's brutal shade of punishment. In those lawless lands, suspicion alone was enough to subject someone to this terrifying trial. Victims were tied up, hands bound, often alongside their feet, and then unceremoniously dunked into the icy embrace of a river or pond. One could wonder about the idea behind this. The big deal is, if you floated, you were guilty, deemed buoyant by the devil's hand himself. Sink, and you might prove your innocence, but at the cost of your life. This gruesome test wasn't just about surviving. It was a cruel contradiction where making it through often meant coming dangerously close to death. The water test or dunking serves as a reminder of how justice was less about fairness and more about fear and superstition during those days. Repeatedly dropped beneath the surface, victims gasped for air, each breath potentially their last. Hypothermia set in quickly, muscles cramping under the relentless chill while lungs screamed for oxygen. At that moment, survival became an excruciating battle with death, a trial by water that left mental scars long after physical wounds had healed. Dunking may have left victims gasping for breath, but pales in comparison to our next punishment, which leaves victims with scarred emotions. Number 2. Stocks and pillories. In the heart of every Wild West town, there was a punishment that didn't spill blood or take anyone's life, but it would make one wish for escape. Stocks and pillories stood as silent reminders of societal order, representing a different kind of cruelty. Unlike their more deadly counterparts, these devices were not meant to kill, but to break spirits. They were powerful tools of public shaming, where wrongdoers were locked in place for everyone to see, turning small offenses into public spectacles. This method sees one stand in the town square, with their head and hands trapped in a wooden frame. This was the fate that awaited those guilty of minor crimes like stealing or being drunk in public. The offender was left vulnerable to the townspeople's whims, who often saw this as an opportunity for amusement rather than correction. While stocked in the wood, the offender is stoned with all manner of things, from rotten food to wastewater or even stones. However, enduring ridicule might sound less severe compared to other punishments on our list, but the psychological toll could be devastating. Public humiliation had a unique cruelty that stripped away dignity and self-worth bit by bit. Occasionally, physical assaults added injury to insult, pushing this method beyond mere social control into the realm of brutality. The intent behind stocks and pillories was clear: maintain order through fear of shame. Yet this often spiraled into a brutal ordeal when crowds took justice into their own hands. But while public shaming left you scarred emotionally, others left victims with more than just scars. They left no survivors at all. Number 1. Being buried alive. Imagine the terrifying feeling of being trapped underground, with dirt pressing down on you as your only companion. This frightening reality was experienced by some unfortunate people in the Wild West, where being buried alive was used as a warning against crime. It was a punishment reserved for the most despicable criminals, traitors, informants, or those who had committed terrible acts that angered the public. This chilling practice meant tying up victims and placing them into shallow graves. The grave's deceptive shallowness hid its sinister purpose, which is to ensure a slow and painful death. As daylight turned to night, the victims' breaths became shorter, each moment feeling like an eternity. Being buried alive wasn't common, but it was used by vigilante groups who took justice into their own hands. These unofficial executioners wanted to scare potential wrongdoers and keep control in chaotic times. The real cruelty was in the mental suffering. Victims faced unimaginable fear, knowing they were doomed beneath layers of soil. Every breath brought them closer to a harsh end, a unique kind of cruelty few other punishments could match. The isolation and helplessness felt by those buried alive made their suffering even worse, serving as a harsh reminder of frontier justice's harsh realities. In these lawless lands, where survival often meant following strict rules, being buried alive showed how far communities would go to protect themselves from perceived dangers. The psychological impact lasted long after the act was done, instilling fear in both victim and witness alike. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.